Thank you so much, Lydia, and welcome everybody. It's an absolute delight for me to be here chairing the very first session of the morning. And I'll just check now that we have J.M. Berger online. Great. Welcome, J.M. I hope that you can hear me. This session is called Mainstreaming Extremism. We will have 3 papers in this session, and the very first one is from J.M. Berger, who is Senior Research Fellow at the Center on Terrorism, Extremism, and Counterterrorism at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. Welcome, J.M., and over to you.
Thank you so much for having me, and I appreciate having the ability to be here remotely. I'm going to talk today, in keeping with the theme of the conference, about a concept called lawful extremism. And I'm going to put some slides up here. Hopefully you'll be able to see them. Okay, I think we're good to go with that. So I started taking an interest in lawful extremism based on some of the work I've been doing on my dissertation and some other work on sort of how we define extremism. As some of you may know, I have a definition of extremism that I've been promoting pretty widely around the field, and it states that extremism is the belief that an in-group's health or success can never be separated from hostile action against an outgroup. And the definition is sort of very consciously intended to address an issue that Lydia mentioned in her opening remarks about how we define extremism, most commonly define extremism as being relative to the mainstream of a society. So the literature definitely shows, I mean, there's a preponderance of definitions that reflect that framing. There's no single definition that really is a consensus definition of extremism, but most of what you'll see in the literature argues that extremism is about values that are far removed from social norms in any given society. Lawful extremism, as I'm defining it using this framing of social identity with in-groups and out-groups, is when movements that we recognize as extremists control the levers of power in society. So my argument is that the relative definition really prevents us from being able to capture a lot of different extremist movements, both capturing the full range of extremist movements and also capturing extremist movements throughout their entire life cycle. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. The idea behind using this kind of social identity framing within groups and outgroups is that we can follow extremist movements through both weak and powerful stages. So lawful extremism is the same thing as extremism, except that it's about a dominant in-group. So, as many of you probably know, the terms in-group and out-group don't really represent dominance. The in-group is just the group to which you belong. The out-group is people who are excluded from your group. So the lawful extremism framing is that a dominant extremist group can never be healthy or successful unless it's engaged in hostile action against a non-dominant group. So it's essentially the same concepts that we use to talk about extremism, but on behalf of the center of a society. So, I rely on the system of meaning framework that Haroro Ingram introduced for looking at extremist texts. In the extremist system of meaning, an in-group is affected by a crisis that is being caused by an out-group, and to solve the crisis, the extremist proposes that the in-group must take hostile action against the out-group. So, to examine this concept of lawful extremism, to see how this system of meaning framework works when the movement is dominant, I wanted to look at a very important historical case in the United States. This is a Supreme Court decision in the United States in 1857. It's known as the Dred Scott decision, and it found that Black people in the United States could essentially rule that they have no rights. The case was brought as what was known as a freedom case. There were freedom suits that were filed by enslaved people in the United States who were trying to win their emancipation through one or another technical kind of reasons. And the case in question, the Dred Scott case, was in many ways a very ordinary case, but it became a flashpoint for this. It was surfacing right around the time that the United States was moving towards civil war, and the Supreme Court decided to hear the case and decided to use it to settle the question of racial slavery in the United States. So all 9 justices wrote opinions in the case. The primary majority opinion was very notoriously written by the Chief Justice, who's named Roger B. Chaney. The ruling, the court case in question, the question that was being asked to resolve was whether Dred Scott could be considered a free person because the person who enslaved him had taken him into free territories while he was enslaved. So because the person who enslaved him had taken him into free territories, the case argued that he could be considered free. He should be released because he was made free when he was in these free territories. As most of you probably are aware, the United States at this time was divided into free states and slave states, with free states mostly in the north and the slave states in the south. So this is a relatively narrow question that could have been answered narrowly, but Taney wanted to make an example out of this case. He wanted to settle the slavery debate, which was becoming very heated and was threatening the integrity of the United States as a unified government. So he went beyond the question of whether this particular person, Dred Scott, could be freed, and made a very sweeping ruling about race in America, essentially arguing that Black people in America had not been included in the Constitution by the framers, and therefore they had no claim to citizenship, and therefore they had no rights under the Constitution. So this is went well beyond the individual case, because there were many free Black people living in the United States at this time. So the decision is a very long decision, and it's very explicit in how it talks about the things that we understand to be extremists. So obviously, if somebody in the modern day was espousing views that are in this decision, we would uncontroversially call them extremist. The decision defines an in-group, white Americans. It defines an out-group, Black Americans. It describes a crisis related to the out-group in very vague terms. It says that, acknowledges the social context in which this took place, which was that the nation was moving towards civil war because the issue of slavery was so divisive. It describes the need for hostile action against the out-group. And in the case of this decision, it wasn't just that some Black people may be enslaved, but that no Black people in America had any rights. That was the escalation of the sort of status quo on this. So this is just sort of shows how this works in the in-group framework. The system of meaning, the white race is the in-group, the Black race is the out-group. The crisis is that the security of the state, the union, is threatened, and the solution is that Black people be totally disenfranchised from all rights of citizenship. So in contemporary extremist movements, we're accustomed to talking about these movements as fringe movements. We'll see that they'll cite scholars, or they will cite history or mythology, fake history, often things that are made up to justify their beliefs. And so many extremist movements will have a detailed historical account. Jihadist movements we see have rely on not just stories of early Muslims, but also, scholarly rulings that they like to cite as calls to authority. And a court ruling does the same thing, and we are accustomed to thinking of that as a more formalized kind of document. But in fact, this is very similar to how extremists use it. And Taney, in writing his opinion, misrepresented a lot of precedent and used precedent not just in sort of a strictly legalistic sense to say, here's the settled law, here are previous court cases that settled this law and that law, but he really used it to create a sweeping description of what American attitudes about race had been at the time the Constitution was written. So his goal is to take that in-group consensus of what white people in America thought and to translate it into law. And so he argued, and in making this argument was very misleading and deceptive about actual history, but he argued that Black people in America had always been regarded as inferior, had been considered unfit to associate with the white race in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. And so that's really the key phrasing in this decision. That is the concept that Taney is putting forward here. Again, if we were talking about this in any kind of modern context, it would be uncontroversially extremist. So we're going to look at a little bit more of these components. The group that he's talking about here is white people being tied to the concept of citizenship. So we have dyads. We have a white and black dyad, and we have a citizen and slave dyad, essentially. And so white people, in the decision, the language he uses, the specific kinds of links that he draws, are the only people who are eligible to be citizens. So citizenship is an all-white category. Not all white people are citizens, but all citizens are white people. Now, not all black people are slaves, but all slaves are black people is the corollary to this. And what this decision argued was that not only was slavery a condition that could only apply to black people, but black people were also without other rights as well. So the fundamental legal argument he's making here is that because Dred Scott was black, he was not a citizen. Because he was not a citizen, he did not have right to recourse in the courts. So by making this argument, he again is sort of leapfrogging the issue of slavery per se and making it an even broader kind of disenfranchisement of black people. He sets up boundaries between the in-group and out-group. And again, these boundaries are the kinds of things that we see in extremist ideology all the time. The only difference here is that it's being legislated from the center instead of from the fringes. He says there's a perpetual and impassable barrier between the races. He talks about edge cases, including people who have multiracial ethnic makeup or free persons of color there were plenty of them in the United States at this point. Free persons of color, he explicitly excluded from being citizens. So, he allows for them not to be enslaved, but he takes away all the other rights that they would have under the federal government. And so he dwells on some of these issues at some length. There's a lot of discussion about miscegenation and the horrific nature of blurring the boundaries. And, all of this stuff, again, is just like very clear examples of language that we today associate with extremism. There was without getting too bogged down into details of this chart, you can go through and you can see how he describes each group. So he describes the in-group, when he's talking about white people, it's always citizens, people with sovereignty, people who are dominant. When he talks about the black group, he has a variety of negative terms. We'll look at a couple of those very quickly in detail. And they are associated with slavery, with inferiority, with stigma and degradation. So you can see in these charts just you can't, of course, this is like looking at a chart almost, and you're looking at it on a big screen. But what we're doing here is taking that system of meaning chart and then associating it with the language that's in the decision. So the out group is described as degraded, unhappy, inferior, enslaved, subjugated. The in group is described as sovereign, constituent members of sovereignty, free, civilized. And the crisis is that the peace and safety of the United States is threatened by the campaign against slavery, and therefore the solution is to create conditions in which slavery can continue. So to do that, he has to distinguish somewhat between black and slave, as in white and citizen. So we have some discussion in this about black people very broadly, and then the condition of enslavement is a product of the characterization of black people as inferior. So the question, I think, that comes out of this, and I'm trying to keep an eye on the time, so I apologize if I'm zooming past a couple of these slides too much. The question is this extremism? So my argument is extremism is the belief that an in-group's health or success is inseparable from hostile action against an out-group. Taney's opinion meets this criteria, and it contains all the elements that we understand to be part of an extremist system of meaning. It defines an in-group and an out-group. It cites a crisis that's related to the out-group. It provides a solution, which is hostile action, disenfranchisement for the decision, which is in the service of enslavement. And the solution is inseparable from the in-group's health. There is no definition of the United States that Cheney provides that can survive the end of slavery. So extremist in-groups are a division of the in-group that we really look at in some of these cases. So if we look at an extremist group like Al-Qaeda, the extremist in-group is Al-Qaeda itself, and the eligible in-group to which they appeal are Muslims. So for white supremacists, like an extremist group might be the Ku Klux Klan, and they're appealing to white Americans as the eligible in-group. So the difference, one of the differences when we're looking at a dominant extremist group here, I've spent a lot of time talking about similarities between this decision and what we understand to be extremism. So this is a look at how some of these differences play out. So in a dominant extremist group, the extremist group, it represents a very large part of the eligible in-group, as opposed to a fringe extremist group like the Adam-Waffen division, for instance, is a very small part of the eligible in-group. So the size of these groups eclipses the character of the eligible in-group, and it changes the nature of the messaging, the extremist messaging that we want to use. So dominant extremist movements are interested in reifying and institutionalizing hostile action against an outgroup, as opposed to a modern fringe extremist group. We would look at them to mobilize and define what the hostile action is. So, a neo-Nazi group would spend a lot of time in its text saying this is what we need to do, whereas an dominant extremist group doesn't have to explain what we need to do. They just have to solidify it. They need to make it into law and give it a sense of permanence. So they're not innovating. They're not looking to try and mobilize people to a new action. They're theorizing justifications to keep the status quo. So Taney, while he was operating in an environment of dramatic change, he was really trying to appeal to the status quo. He was trying to define the status quo. He's saying that the status quo in this country has always been that Black people are enslaved, and this is the status quo that we should continue. So he's not trying to mobilize supporters as a fringe movement does, as Al-Qaeda seeks to mobilize supporters with its propaganda. ISIS seeks to mobilize supporters. Instead, he's trying to demobilize detractors, because things are the way he wants it to be now. So he wants people to stay home. He wants the people who are dissenting not to show up and not to dissent. In that sense, there's a big focus. If you see a fringe extremist group, if you look at Abdullah Azzam's writings, for instance, he is a precursor to Al-Qaeda and recruiting for the jihad in Afghanistan in the 1980s, what you see is that he's very concerned with distinguishing between his group, the extremist group, and the eligible in-group of Muslims. So he's critiquing the eligible in-group. And we see this in I've written about this some, and we see it in a lot of extremist texts. They're very concerned with critiquing the in-group, saying what's wrong with the in-group, because they have to explain why the in-group doesn't share their beliefs. In this case, you don't have that in-group critique because you want to make it appear, you want to give the sense that there is consensus in the in-group that this hostile action, that enslavement has to continue, and therefore you want to depict these groups as the same. The extremist movement pro-slavery is the same as the eligible in-group white Americans in this view. And so the rhetoric that is used reflects that. We don't see that in-group critique. We only see, a discussion of how things should be. So this is, I've been trying to cram a lot of content into a very short amount of time here. So I apologize if I've been blasting through this a little bit, but I want to sort of, now that I've given you a sense of what the research is and the text that I'm looking at, I'll give you some of these findings, and there will be a paper coming out a little later this year, hopefully, that you'll be able to sort of dive into the actual arguments that I'm making in real detail with citations to the text. So the examination that I've been making of this suggests to me a couple of really key differences between fringe groups and dominant groups. So lawful extremism, the extremist in-group eclipses the eligible in-group. So the eligible in-group is not uniform in favor of the extremist in-group, but there's a plurality. There's some strong force in here that makes the two more similar. So the fringe group, your modern neo-Nazis, your ISIS kinds of groups, are trying to disrupt or reverse the status quo. So they want to disrupt the status quo, or they want to return the status quo to something that's centuries old or based in mythological times. Whereas a dominant group wants to maintain and entrench the status quo. So we're not seeing the same kind of language in terms of throwing things out, overthrowing things, creating chaos. We're much more focused on maintaining stability. We don't want to mobilize supporters to a revolution. You want to demobilize people who are trying to fight a revolution. Fringe group needs to recruit members, and so you see a lot of recruitment language in their texts. What we see in lawful extremism is we're trying to prevent defection. So we're not trying to get new people in, we're trying to keep people from going over to the other side. So in the service of all these things, as I mentioned before, the fringe extremist groups have a tendency to include in-group critique. So they're going to criticize the in-group for not matching their values, whereas the dominant group is focused on out-group critique. So the Taney decision is full of commentary about Black people. As time frame, it's, fringe groups are either in the past, distant past, or the far future. Dominant group is present in the now. And I'll just close out by saying there's a body of research that you can read about in my paper or on your own, and it's fringe extremist groups rely on what we call an uncertainty identity framework impulses, where extremism is a solution to feelings of uncertainty, whereas a dominant legal lawful extremist group is focused on just system justification, which is a theory that seeks to explain why people support the way things are, even if it's to their disadvantage. So I hope that was semi-coherent, and I will get this paper out hopefully by the end of the year, and you'll be able to see the argument in a slightly more organized form. So thank you.
Thank you so much, JM. That I'm ready to cite your paper right now. That was a riveting presentation, and I think really helps frame up some of the theoretical and conceptual issues brilliantly that we're going to be grappling with. So thank you once.
Thank you. A very good morning, everyone. First of all, my gratitude to AVERT for accepting my abstract and inviting me to interact with the top academicians and practitioners of counterterrorism in Australia. What I'm going to share this morning is basically a part of a joint paper that I'm doing with Dr. Julian Rugen at Macquarie University that examines how the ingress of radical organizations threatens fragile democratic processes in a country like Pakistan, which officially is labeled as a hybrid democracy. So to start with, we have basically looked at a multi-level analysis of extremism. We argue that extremism happens to be a multi-causal phenomena. And when we talk about countering any sort of extremism, we need to basically come up with a strategy that dissects the root causes and suggests changes accordingly as per the level of individual, organizations, and society. When we talk about mainstreaming radical organizations, essentially we are talking about the level of organization and the level of involvement. So we basically started by looking at how terrorist organizations end. And in that regard, a RAND study came very useful for us, which examines 648 terrorist organizations, which were formed from 1968 to 2006. And according to that RAND study, most of the terrorist organizations, which is roughly 43% of terrorist organizations, they have ended because they transitioned into the political arena. And that is usually basically the political transformation. The second most effective set of strategy that leads to the termination of terrorist organization is law enforcement agencies' response, followed by a military response that remains the least effective response when it comes to countering extremist organizations. But the study also notes that the goals of terrorist organizations are inversely related to their potential to transform into a political organization, which means that narrower the goals of a terrorist organization, the more likely the organization is to evolve into a political entity. So having that framework in mind, we have basically looked at different terrorist organizations across the world that have sought transition. And if you look at different conflict theaters around the world, there have been a number of instances where terrorist organizations have transformed, or some sort of political engineering has been done to transform them into political players. First and foremost is African National Congress in South Africa. Then most recently, a decade ago, Hizb Islami in Afghanistan, which was transitioned when the American international forces were stationed in Afghanistan. And of course, that happened with the consent of all the international players, including the legitimate Afghanistan government at that time. We have seen the example of Hamas, which have attempted politics, but still struggling to evolve into a political organization. And then you have the case study of Maoists in Nepal after the Orange Revolution there back in 2007 and 8. Maoists of Nepal, they have transitioned into a political organization following an elaborate DDR program by the United Nations. And the terrorist organization that we are focusing is Lashkar-e-Taiba. Lashkar-e-Taiba is basically a UN-designated terrorist organization that is also known for its involvement in international terrorism, and most importantly, the Mumbai terrorist attack in 2008. This organization, which is very important from international and national counterterrorism perspective, it has attempted political transition since 2017. The organization first relabeled itself as Milli Muslim League, failed, it could not sort registration, and then renamed itself with a different title. And when we spoke to the members of organization for this paper, most of them, they termed that it is a normal process, as many terrorist organizations around the world have transitioned under the UN DDR process. But of course, when you are implementing the DDR process, it requires a different set of preconditions. When United Nations has implemented DDR since 1985, you would see that these DDR programs, they are usually initiated after the resolution of civil war. It is specifically through a formal cessation of hostilities that also involves resolution of conflicting fractions, and a formal request from the host government is initiated to implement any sort of DDR under the auspices of United Nations. But when we talk about international terrorist organizations such as Lashkar-e-Taiba, there are a number of complexities involved in terms of implementing a UN-sanctioned DDR on LET. Firstly, its involvement in international terrorism. Secondly, the kind of relationship that the organization enjoys with Pakistani security establishment. So for a number of complexities, I don't think that the first generation DDRs or the second generation DDRs could be successfully implemented and tailored to transform a terrorist organization like LET. Then it essentially calls for modifying the established frameworks of transforming militant organizations. We have to look beyond first generation DDR, we have to look beyond second generation DDR, and we have to modify the DDVE frameworks accordingly if an attempt has to be made to mainstream these terrorist organizations. So to understand this transformation beyond DDR, we have adopted this six level of analysis framework by Judith et al., which basically advocates for looking at the nature of the actor, the characteristic of the armed conflict, and there are four prerequisites that are required for a terrorist organization to successfully transit into a political organization. First is, of course, a terrorist organization has to openly renounce violence. Its ideology has to be consistent with democracy. The decision to transit has to be taken through organizational cohesion. And finally, there has to be recognition of that transition, not only domestically, but internationally as well. So using this framework, we have seen where Lashkar-e-Taiba has went wrong and why the organization is still struggling to morph into a political organization. So when we look at the nature of the actor, it's an organization with a hierarchical command and control structure. And such organizations are more likely to undergo political transition in a disciplinary way. The more organized a terrorist organization is, it becomes theoretically easier to transit them, because fragmentation can lead to internal factionalism following the terrorist organization's decision to become a part of political mainstream. And the RAND study also supports this notion that the organizations with centralized command and control structures, they are usually likely to transit more easily. Then if you look at the group's ideology, it combines nationalism with religion. That's quite different from Al-Qaeda and Daesh, because if you look at Al-Qaeda and Daesh ideology, they certainly do not believe in the idea of nation states. They believe in the idea of pan-Islamism. But if you look at Lashkar-e-Taiba, there is some sort of tolerance and endorsement for the idea of nation state. And if you look at Lashkar-e-Taiba's political objectives, because of the kind of association it enjoys with Pakistan's security establishment, their goals are usually aligned with that of the Pakistan security establishment. For instance, it stands on anti-Pakistan terrorist organizations such as Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, Al-Qaeda, Daesh. It stands on nuclear strategy. It stands on Pakistan's relations with India, and etc. But the characteristic of the armed conflict is fast changing, the armed conflict in which the Lashkar-e-Taiba operates in. What are those dramatic shifts that we have seen in South Asia at the moment? There was a time back in 2001 during global war on terror when Islamabad was relevant to American global strategy. It was one of the major non-NATO allies in the global fight on terrorism. But as the US global strategy moves from countering extremism to countering China, and of course a resurgent Russia, there is a shift in the way Washington looks at Islamabad. India has assumed more prominence for the US global strategy for its perceived utility in countering China. Therefore, there was a time when in the past, Islamabad could go for different adventures and get away with it thanks to the American patronage. But the things have changed in a dramatic way. And this is also reflecting in case of Kashmir as well, where United States has reoriented its official stance more in line with the official stance of India. Historically, that was not the case. United States always favored multilateralism on Kashmir. United States always advocated for an enhanced role of international organizations, but now it sees Kashmir as a bilateral issue between India and Pakistan. So what happened as this alliance between Islamabad and Washington weakened, Islamabad came under tremendous pressure to recalibrate its policies on different terrorist organizations, including Lashkar-e-Taiba. And that's where Lashkar-e-Taiba basically decided to morph into a political organization. It is certainly facing a number of challenges. As I've said, that renouncing violence is the first prerequisite to transit into a political organization. But if you look at Lashkar-e-Taiba, it is yet to come up with a public renunciation of violence. We have not seen Lashkar-e-Taiba openly and publicly renouncing violence, while they attempt politics. We have examined the public discourse of this organization. While it attempts politics, it has largely been focused on the issues of governance, inflation, and global Muslim solidarity, quite different from its historical focus on jihad against India, against infidels. So there is some sort of, at least rhetorically, there is a shift. Kashmir, it finds little mention in the political campaign and narrative of Milli Muslim League, which is the political front of Lashkar-e-Taiba. And the term jihad is growingly absent from their public discourse. On Kashmir, this organization, it calls for an active role of United Nations and government and international organizations for the resolution of Kashmir issue. Does the participation in electoral process signify an actual change? We believe not, because LET's ideology is not consistent with democracy. They are known for their historic aversion to democracy, not just Lashkar-e-Taiba. You look at any other Salafi group, be it Al-Qaeda or Daesh, there is a historical aversion to the idea of democracy. There have been instances where Lashkar-e-Taiba has termed democracy un-Islamic. There is no record of internal debates on democracy during last 1 decade. It was an overnight decision on part of Lashkar-e-Taiba. And certainly when decisions are taken so abruptly, it creates its own suspicion. We have not seen any internal debates within the organization as to what led the leadership of those organizations to consider democracy. And then it advocates, at least rhetorically, for a system based on the principles of Islam. It is not really unique to Lashkar-e-Taiba. If you look at other mainstream Islamic political parties in Pakistan, they usually resort to such tactics. What we are seeing now in the discourse of Lashkar-e-Taiba is that Kashmir appears as a secondary theme to other popular issues which resonate well with the masses at the moment. That is governance, inflation, that is fostering national unity against in the time of political instability in Pakistan. And of course, Lashkar-e-Taiba, when it reorients into politics, is doing its best to create a counter narrative against the terrorist organizations which have been hitting Pakistani state for last 20 years. So that's where Lashkar-e-Taiba becomes useful for the Pakistani state. Organizational cohesion, the decision has to be taken with a consensus, because fragmentation impedes the transition. There have been thus far no documented instances of internal fractures following the establishment of MML. Thus far, they have been able to maintain their organizational cohesion, which may be a positive. But if there is fragmentation, it can impede the transition process. Sometimes what happens is that terrorist organizations, they usually try to subvert the democratic process by having a two-pronged strategy. There's one fraction which basically attempts politics, and while simultaneously maintaining the militant wing. In case of Lashkar-e-Taiba, interestingly, we are seeing that the entire organization is trying to transform into a political organization. We have not seen high-profile terrorist attacks perpetrated by Lashkar-e-Taiba after Mumbai attacks. That was in 2008. And in Kashmir, which was basically the center of Lashkar-e-Taiba-led terrorism, there too, the acts by Lashkar-e-Taiba have gone down significantly. Noted, thank you. So, but there's one problem with the Lashkar-e-Taiba's organizational structure while it attempts politics. Theoretically, an organization has to give up its command and control structure that it has maintained during the conflict times. Lashkar-e-Taiba is yet to do that. The central authority is still there. They have just changed the labels of the organization, but the command structure, the wartime command structure of Lashkar-e-Taiba is still there that can impede the transition. Recognition, the group faced a difficult time on this part as well. Internationally, the United States openly condemned this so-called transition and also banned Milli Muslim League, which was the political front of Lashkar-e-Taiba. India saw this as a remobilization attempt by Pakistan, remobilization by political means. So India also opposed this idea of morphing LET into a political organization. Interestingly, the domestic feedback, the domestic response was also discouraging. The civil society in Pakistan was opposed to this idea. The mainstream political parties opposed this idea of mainstreaming radicals, and the English media was also opposed to that. Urdu print media was little supportive of that. So finally, because of this international and national opposition on the recommendation of Pakistani intelligence agencies, Milli Muslim League's registration request was cancelled in 2017, and it was not registered as a political party. But it has not given up yet. So theoretically, when we talk about LET's political transition, it stays at negative minimal stage of transformation. A logical transition would require a religious decree that endorses democracy, that renounces the use of violence, not only in Pakistan, but also outside as well. A formal DDR is not a solution here because of the problems that I have mentioned. And one important point, which will be interesting for those who are sitting here, what has happened in Afghanistan in 2021 and its fallout for Pakistan, I think that should trigger some sort of fundamental recalibration in Islamabad's security strategy, because Islamabad chose to support Afghan Taliban against international consensus. Afghan Taliban, they are in power in Afghanistan, and it is having dire consequences for Pakistan's internal security. Things have not turned up as Pakistan was expecting. So I think this should trigger some fundamental reorientation in Pakistan's strategy, and Pakistan will be better off with a well-calibrated transformative program that could serve as a confidence-building measure between India and Pakistan as well. I thank you very much for your attention.